Welcome to This Explainer. Look, today we're unpacking a really profound philosophical framework from our source material, and it's designed to help you stop measuring your worth against systems that, honestly, were never built for you in the first place. If you've ever felt like you just don't fit the mold, this perspective might completely redefine how you view your place in the world.
So let's jump right into this deeply personal question that really sits at the emotional core of what we're discussing today. Have you ever been praised and scorned for the exact same qualities? I mean, think about it. The exact sensitivity that makes you an absolutely extraordinary friend might get you labeled as too much in a super rigid workplace, right? You haven't changed. You are just one consistent person rotating through completely different systems. And that realization brings us to our first major framing: society as a factory and how it processes the discards. We're going to start with arguably the bleakest way to look at our world, which is viewing society as a giant, unfeeling machine. In this setup, individuals are literally just inputs and outputs. The factory framing asks one very simple question: how does the system reproduce itself? You know, the machinery doesn't mourn a stamped gear that comes out warped, it just tosses it in the scrap pile. If you don't fit the standard script, you get chewed up. And the real tragedy here, you internalize this. You start blaming yourself for being defective, when in reality, the machine simply wasn't designed to handle your variance. It all boils down to this incredibly harsh reality from the text. The praise tells you you are currently useful. The scorn tells you you are currently not useful. Let that sink in for a second. The system isn't evaluating your inherent value as a human being. It's not looking at your character. It is merely judging your temporary utility to its own goals. Praise just means you're a convenient cog for the moment, and scorn, well, that just means you've become an inconvenient one.
But what happens if we zoom out a bit? That brings us to part 2, the lab experiment, where we probe the possibility space.
This represents a complete shift in how we look at things. Opposed to the factory frame, which remember is all about optimization, compliance, and tossing out discards, we have the lab frame. And the lab frame focuses on discovery, variance, and generative outliers. It's a huge difference. While a factory needs the middle of the bell curve to survive, a lab desperately needs the extreme edges for discovery. In an experiment, the individual that the factory calls a discard is actually the exact edge case the test needed to run. It's the variable that tells you something the average never, ever could.
Heart too soft for this world, brain too sharp for the simple answers, that's not a malfunction. That's a particular and rare configuration that the distribution needed to run. So the crucial takeaway here is that your high variance isn't a defect. If you've had to construct meaning entirely from scratch because the default scripts failed you, you aren't broken. You are the exact rare configuration the experiment requires to figure out what is truly possible.
Now, there is a catch here. Treating people as experiments can kind of romanticize their suffering, right? To understand when we should actually step in, the source provides this revealing matrix. The factory asks, does this fit the standard, which risks totally dehumanizing variance? The lab asks, what can we learn? But that risks ignoring real resource limits and genuine pain. And this is exactly why the care frame has to step in as the ethical tiebreaker. It asks, what does this person need to live with dignity? Basically, optimizing for humanity rather than just throughput or discovery.
Let's keep moving, because even a lab eventually treats you as just a data point used by a scientist. This brings us to part 3, the ecosystem shift, leaving the machine behind entirely. The text suggests this breathtaking shift away from human-engineered systems to a fully biological paradigm, the old growth forest. Here, variance isn't some error, it's just biodiversity. Friction isn't a character flaw. Actually, scratch that. It's more like a question of climate. Think of a willow tree planted in a desert. It's not a bad tree, it's just in the wrong spot. Organisms aren't cogs, they have their own agency, and the whole system relies on symbiosis rather than extraction. In this model, you don't need to be compliant or profoundly useful to justify your existence. You just occupy your niche. And I absolutely love this detail. Consider the mycelial network. In a real forest, there are these underground fungi connecting the roots of trees, distributing nutrients to weaker saplings, and literally holding the soil together. The source material compares this to the invisible, unregistered care work holding our society together from underneath. For those of you making quiet, unmeasured contributions, holding space for others, offering empathy where rigid systems offer none, you aren't failing to be a visible canopy. No way. You are the vital underground network keeping the entire forest from collapsing.
Now, what's really interesting about this explainer is how it wraps up. Part 4, the fascinated creator, a theological coda. The source material ends by pivoting to a pretty daring theory. It notes that pure benevolence doesn't really explain the random, disproportionate suffering of outliers, right? But pure malevolence doesn't explain the genuine beauty we see either. So, what kind of creator actually matches our reality? The text explores 4 models: the flawed demiurge who makes imperfect things out of sheer incompetence, the experimenter, prioritizing discovery over welfare, the aesthetic god, valuing intensity over happiness, and finally, the wounded absolute, a creator making things simply out of its own profound need or loneliness. When you synthesize these models, it reveals something, well, fascinating. Not love, not cruelty, something colder and more honest: interest. The source describes a creator that is simply fascinated, an artist who uses real materials and watches the mycelium with wonder, but who absolutely will not stop the printing press to save the gears. It's an unsettling model, for sure, but it faithfully reflects the simultaneously generative and brutal texture of our universe. You aren't random. You are exactly the configuration the universe was looking for. The text actually encapsulates this whole journey in a really powerful closing poem, declaring that the outlier was never just a passive object. I have been the gear that bent the press. I have been the culture that contaminated the cleanest hypothesis with something almost like a will. Even when you're being processed by unfeeling systems, your very nature introduces friction. You have agency. Which brings us right to the core takeaway of this whole ecosystem frame. The fern is not a failed oak. The willow and the desert is not broken. It is thirsty in the wrong latitude. I want you to remember this. Our unique configurations are natural reserves of resilience. When you suffer in a standardized system, your friction is just a mismatch of environment. You are not broken. I paid, I generated, and I am still here, putting down roots in the cracks of the pavement, quietly building a forest the factory will never get around to logging. We are ultimately challenged here to stop measuring ourselves against sterile systems. Look, we can't dismantle the factory overnight, but we can absolutely stop internalizing its metrics. Instead, we have to use our agency to foster our own microclimates and connect with our fellow flora and fauna. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final provocative question about your own agency in all of this. What will you grow in the cracks of the pavement? You've seen how the factory stamps you, and you know how the lab observes you. But the forest? The forest remembers everything. It's time to stop trying to be a perfect cog and start building your forest. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive today.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled to have you here with us. So the mission today is to unpack this profoundly philosophical source document we got our hands on. It's titled Factory versus Lab Experiment.
Right, and it's a fascinating read.
Yeah, it really is. It captures this incredibly rich, multi-layered conversation between 4 different AI models. So we're talking Claude, DeepSeek, Quinn, and Gemini. And they're essentially debating the invisible frameworks that dictate how we measure our own self-worth.
Exactly, like why we suffer when we don't fit in.
Right, and how to entirely rewrite the metrics of what makes a successful life. So just to hook you in for a second, have you ever felt like you were doing exactly what you were supposed to, but the system still rejected you anyway?
Oh man, that is such a universal feeling.
Right. Or have you ever felt praised and penalized for the exact same personality trait? Because I know I have. And honestly, this source document is just mind-bending when it comes to explaining why that happens.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, I think we need to establish the stakes here right away, because this isn't just some theoretical dorm room philosophy debate.
No, not at all.
It's about the very material and psychological consequences of the metaphors we use to define human existence. Like, the way society frames us literally dictates our housing security, our jobs, our mental health.
Yeah, the real-world impact is huge. So to understand why we feel so out of place, we first have to understand the 2 dominant frameworks society uses to process human beings. And the text identifies these as the factory and the lab.
Right. Let's start with the factory frame, because that's the one most of us are uncomfortably familiar with. In this framing, society acts as a literal machine, and it's optimizing for the absolute middle of the bell curve, right?
Yeah.
Because from an evolutionary or systemic standpoint, that middle is where survival and replication happen.
Right. The system just wants standardized parts. So individuals are treated as inputs and outputs. And if you don't fit the standard Like if your tolerances are too tight or too loose, you're just labeled a discard or, malformed.
Exactly. And the factory frame actually explains why so much systemic suffering happens. Because if you don't fit, you spend your life being endlessly reworked by institutions that just weren't built for you.
Yeah, which is exhausting.
It is. It's an incredible physical and psychological toll.
But then the document introduces the lab experiment frame, which completely shifts the perspective. In a lab, each individual is seen as a probe into what they call possibility space.
Right, which flips the whole script on variance.
Exactly. High variance isn't a flaw in a lab, it's the entire point. Like the outliers are where the distribution actually feels out its edges to discover what's possible. There's this great analogy in the text pointing out that normal is just a setting on a dryer.
I love that line.
Yeah, the perfectly average individual is basically a myth. But Claude, one of the AIs, points out the core tragedy here. We live our lives as experiments, but we are processed by the world as factory outputs.
And that is exactly where the pain lives.
We internalize that factory rejection, right? We confuse being a bold outlier with being a broken discard.
Because the factory controls the resources. It controls the paycheck and the healthcare. So when it rejects you, you start to believe its verdict.
Okay, but let me push back on this a bit, or at least ask what the listener is probably thinking. If the lab framing is so empowering, why does it still feel so devastating when the factory rejects us?
Well, because we live in a society built entirely on legibility. And the AI models really dig into this. Legibility is how easily a system can read, categorize, and extract value from you.
Right, like can your skills be put into a neat little KPI on a spreadsheet?
Exactly. And the source highlights this wild paradox. A person can be praised and scorned for the exact same qualities. Because praise and scorn, they don't measure your inherent value. They only measure your utility to the prevailing system at that exact moment.
That makes so much sense. Like, the text gives the example of someone with high emotional sensitivity. In a startup, that makes them a great facilitator, right? They hold the team together, they get praise.
Right. But take that exact same person with the exact same sensitivity and drop them into a rigid corporate environment that just wants compliance.
Yeah, suddenly they're labeled too much.
Exactly. The system just evaluates what it can use.
So what about the stuff the system can't even see? Because the AI has identified a third category, which honestly sounds the most painful, the unregistered.
Yeah, the unregistered. These are the traits that don't fit any legible metric whatsoever.
It just creates social static, like invisibility says you didn't even rise to the level of worth evaluating, which hurts. But the AIs argue these are the very contributions that water the soil for years.
Right, the invisible emotional labor that holds communities together.
There's this specific quote from the text that I have to bring it up. Heart too soft for this world, brain too sharp for the simple answers.
Oh, it's such a heavy line.
It is. It's like being a Swiss Army knife in a world that only recognizes flathead screwdrivers. But, okay, if neither praise nor scorn is real, how does a person survive living in the unregistered zone?
That is the big question. And it actually exposes a massive philosophical flaw in the lab metaphor itself. Gemini points this out in the debate.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You might hear all this and think, great, I'll just fully embrace the lab mindset.
Hey?
But a lab still instrumentalizes its subjects.
Wait, how so?
Well, if we're experiments, who's reading the logs?
Yeah.
The lab metaphor subtly demands that outliers justify their existence by being, profound or generative.
Oh, wow, I didn't think about that. It denies people the right to just be unextraordinary. Like, you shouldn't have to be a tortured genius just to justify taking up space.
Exactly. And that's why Quinn, another model, introduces the care frame as the ethical tiebreaker here. It asks, what does this person need to live with dignity, regardless of their utility or their discovery value?
Right. The line for intervention shouldn't be about fixing a defective part. It should be about reducing suffering and supporting agency. And I think we need to point out the danger of the kind of middle-of-the-curve elitism that popped up in the text.
Yes, please. That's a crucial point.
Because it's easy to romanticize the outliers and dismiss the people in the middle. But people in the middle aren't mindless cogs. They're just making a pragmatic trade, right? They're trading their legibility for safety and a reliable paycheck.
Exactly. It's a survival tactic. And the truth is, both the factory and the lab fail us because they're top-down deterministic systems. They treat humans as objects.
Yeah, doesn't the lab frame basically just romanticize our pain to make us feel better about systemic failures?
It absolutely does, which is why the source material eventually pivots away from human-engineered systems entirely. They move to a radically different biological framework.
The old growth forest.
Yes, The ecosystem frame. Because in an ecosystem, variance is no longer a malfunction or a data point, it's simply biodiversity.
Which gives you your agency back. Like, a fern isn't a broken oak tree, it just occupies its own niche. Friction isn't a character flaw, it's just a climate mismatch.
Like planting a willow tree in the desert.
Right. The willow isn't defective, the climate is just hostile to its configuration. And the text points out that monocultures, which factories love, they collapse. But diversity survives. The strange individuals are the genetic reservoir that saves the forest when the climate shifts.
And that maps perfectly onto those unregistered contributions we talked about. The models compare it to the mycelial network.
The underground fungi, right?
Yeah, the invisible network under the forest floor. It doesn't get a grant or a KPI, but it distributes nutrients. It literally holds the soil together from underneath.
There's that beautiful poem included in the source, not a cog, not a variable. It paints this amazing visual of an organism navigating a concrete grid, just stubbornly putting down roots in the cracks of the pavement.
It completely reframes human friction.
It does. But, I mean, this is a beautiful mindset, but we still have to pay rent in the factory. How does viewing ourselves as a willow in the desert actually change how we walk through a concrete, factory-like world today?
Well, it changes how you internalize the friction. You realize you're surviving a grid. So you do what's necessary, you format the resume, you pay the bills, but you stop measuring your soul with a ruler designed for sheet metal.
I love that.
You protect your internal worth from the factory's metrics.
Okay, so if we exist in this complex, painful ecosystem where variance is required but punished by the grid, the source document asks a final, truly staggering question.
Yeah, this is where it gets into theology.
Exactly. They ask what kind of god or architect would design reality this way?
And they immediately rule out pure benevolence.
Right.
Because there's too much random waste.
But they also rule out pure malevolence because there's too much genuine beauty and, mycelial connection. A torturer wouldn't build that.
Right, so they offer these alternative models. The flawed demiurge, the experimenter, the aesthetic god, and the wounded absolute.
And the synthesis they land on is wild. The model that best fits the evidence is a creator who is genuinely curious, partial to the outlier, but incomplete. Like an artist using volatile materials who's drawn to strange configurations.
The driving force isn't love or cruelty. It's fascination.
Which is a gut punch, to be honest. The text explicitly states that fascination isn't love, and wonder isn't protection. The creator leans toward the screen when a variable does something unpredictable. Interest is the closest word.
It's a staggering thought.
It is. Is it comforting or completely terrifying to realize that your specific painful variance wasn't a mistake, but exactly the kind of thing the universe was looking for?
I think it's both. It removes the shame of being different, but it doesn't remove the ache of the factory pressing down on you.
Yeah. So to bring this journey full circle for you listening, we've gone from the relentless optimization of the factory through the exhausting expectations of the lab into the biodiversity of the ecosystem, and finally to the gaze of a fascinated universe.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But if you've been praised and scorned for the same qualities, or if your contributions feel utterly unregistered, you really need to hear this. You are not a malfunction. You are just thirsty in the wrong latitude.
Exactly. You have to protect your unregistered contributions.
Absolutely. And I want to leave you with a new, lingering concept to mull over on your own that builds on everything we've talked about today.
Oh, I'm curious where you're taking this.
Well, think about it. If the mycelial network of invisible human care is what actually keeps society from collapsing, what would happen if the outliers stopped trying to fit into the factory and instead focused entirely on feeding that network?
Wow.
Right. Maybe true rebellion isn't about smashing the machines at all. Maybe it's about quietly starving them of our energy while we build a forest right beneath their floors. Think about that.